Armed conflict has been with us since the dawn of civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of armies as far back as 10,000 BC. Military history has always existed on a grand scale, with legendary battles fought on land, sea, and air. From ancient daggers to modern medals of honor, in expert hands, these relics reveal the stories of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Join us as we unlock the secrets of Militaria. Today on Militaria, we will look at trench art in the form of an intricately crafted wicker basket, priceless treasures from the Boer War, as well as a Scottish sword with a bloody history. Kevin Robbins looks at a 17th century Scottish basket-hilt sword that provided increased hand protection.
Basket-hilts started to come into vogue in Europe at around 1600s because it protected the hands more and more easily to handle rather than taking a big 1.5 or 2-handed sword.
Mark People looks at a wicker woven basket made by Polish soldiers recovering in Scotland.
They would go out on the estate, get fresh air and exercise and things, but pick the grasses dry and were able to weave these baskets, some artisan skill that they brought with them.
Andrew Moss looks at a custom-made box that houses Boer War medals, as well as a 120-year-old chocolate.
So if I open it up, you can see it still has the original chocolate in there. Often you'll find the box but not the chocolate, and the chocolate just makes it that much more interesting.
My name is Danielle Graham, and today I brought treasures from the Boer War, from my great-grandmother's brother. I brought in a custom-made box that holds his Boer War medals, a clip of .303 rounds, and a box of 120-year-old chocolate.
Africa has a sad and violent history of European imperialism. The Dutch East India Company began sending settlers in the mid-1600s to what is now South Africa to exploit its abundant natural resources. By the mid-1800s, the colonies were under the control of the British Empire, except for 2 independent states, controlled by the Boers, who were the descendants of the early Dutch settlers. At the turn of the 20th century, the discovery of rich deposits of gold and diamonds sparked a 3-year conflict between the British and the Boers, known as the Boer War. More than 7,000 Canadians fought for Britain. It was Canada's first, and perhaps least respected, foreign war.
So Danielle, you've brought us in some artifacts. What can you tell us about these artifacts?
Well, this is a presentation case that was created for the medals, a clip of .303 rounds, and a box of 120-year-old chocolate that belonged to my great-grandmother's brother, Arthur Wheeler. She had the presentation case made, and they've been passed down through the family, eventually to me.
Well, it's a very nice grouping of medals. The first one right here is the Queen Sudan medal that was issued for the reconquest of Sudan in the 1890s. This was the Khedive's Sudan medal. And also I see here that you have the original Queen Victoria chocolate box that was given to every member of the armed forces serving in the Boer War. So if I open it up, we can see it still has the original chocolate in there. Often you'll find the box but not the chocolate, and the chocolate just makes it that much more interesting for collectors. What's very interesting is that you've kept it in the same family. It's part of the family lore.
It is,
yeah,
very
nice.
much so. All my life I'd known about the chocolate. But it wasn't until my grandfather was moving and he passed on to me the chocolate, but also the presentation box with the medals and the clip of rounds. And I didn't know that existed.
So Danielle, do you know much about your relative?
I know he joined the military in something like 1896-97. He joined very young and died very young.
Your relative served in the Army Service Corps, so this man would have been involved in supply the troops. That wasn't an easy job, especially in that time with the logistics of the time. Without seeing the service file, I can tell you that he served in this campaign. That was a reconquest of the Sudan area.
Can I just ask you what the Sudan conflict was about?
In the 19th century, most European powers were trying to create colonies in Africa. The attempt to take the Sudan and to control that region was imperial expansion, to grab as much as Africa as they could. The first time the British were in the Sudan didn't really go very well for them. It culminated in the death of General Gordon at Khartoum, and so they started a reconquest of Sudan to control that area. I guess if we're looking at from a 21st century perspective, it was the high watermark of the British Empire, basically grabbing more territory at the expense of the little guy, but that's the way empires work. Danielle, do you know much about the Boer War?
No, not really.
The Boer War basically started in the late 19th century. It was a result of an influx of English settlers into the area. The Boers wanted nothing to do with that. They were a very independent people, and the British government got involved, escalated things to a military conflict. In the beginning, the Boers successfully defeated the British, but then the British turned to techniques such as scorched earth. They also gathered up a lot of the Boer families, women and children, put them into concentration camps, but it basically convinced the Boers to surrender. Canada participated in the Boer War. They sent over a contingent of about 7,000 troops. And really, it was the first war where Canada got involved in a foreign conflict. And the Canadians did very, very well. One of the most famous battles for Canada is the Battle of Paardeberg, where the Royal Canadian Regiment attempted to attack during the day, were repulsed by the Boer sharpshooters, and eventually went in at night and were able to take the Boer encampment, and were applauded by the British for their dashing in battle. So there's an interesting story here for Canada, as well as your relative and the British Commonwealth. In the time of the Boer War, there was a large amount of patriotic fervor for the Commonwealth. For a lot of these young men that were going overseas to fight, it was the right thing to do. We look back at it now and we think it's horrible, but they wanted to go, see the world and defend the empire. So Danielle, another thing I find interesting about your group is it's a very poignant reminder of the cost of war. Your relative who was 23 years of age died, never got to have a family. He died of disease, which was quite a problem for the British in South Africa. Whenever you have a large body of men, diseases like that spread very, very quickly amongst troops. There was really little they can do except to ride out diseases, and many, many men succumbed to that.
I would ask my grandfather if he knew anything else about Arthur Wheeler. This was his mother's brother. She would have known him. There must have been stories that I just haven't got.
I'm just curious, what are your plans for something like this?
Well, I'm torn about that. It has been in my family, and a big part of me thinks that it should remain in our family. But I do remember my grandfather saying, I'd like to donate it to a museum when I'm gone. To me, it has immense value, and it's not a monetary value, but in terms of its ability to tell a story, it's invaluable. It's a part of my family, and I'm sharing something about a person who's real. I think that, sometimes that can be lost.
These are very valuable things. They're a part of our history that need to be preserved. It deserves to be on a wall and be respected. I would encourage people to dig into their family history and especially their military history, and maybe discover something about their relatives that they didn't know.
The value for me is in the story, and keeping that for so long. My family's kept this chocolate for 120 years. I will not be the person who gets rid of it. I just won't.
Danielle, thank you for bringing these medals in. As I say, I love them, and I think they're a great piece of history and tells the story of one individual's sacrifice for his country. Thank you for bringing them in.
Coming up on Militaria.
They would go out on the estate, get fresh air and exercise and things, but pick the grasses, dry it, and were able to weave these baskets. My name's Jane McKay, and I brought primarily a wicker woven, very intricately woven basket made by Polish soldiers during the war in my mom's home in Scotland, which was called Montrave House. She brought it from Scotland when she moved here in 1946, landed at Pier 21 with my older sister.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. The British Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, famously rallied the spirits of his nation with those words. During the Second World War, Great Britain stood strong against Nazi Germany. Successfully defending Britain against German invasion was key to the Allied victory. Its naval bases and its airfields served as the launch points for the D-Day invasion of Normandy, the turning point of the war in Europe. Throughout the war, England and Scotland hosted camps for Commonwealth soldiers as they embarked for battle, and hospitals that treated the hundreds of thousands of servicemen who returned wounded.
So James, what do we have here today?
It's a woven grass basket made by soldiers that were patients in the convalescent hospital in Montrave, which was my mom's home in Scotland, that had been converted to a convalescent hospital during the war. It's in Fife in Scotland, which is just north of the Firth of Forth and west of St. Andrews, so Cooper would be the closest town.
It's very detailed and it's very ornamental, particularly with almost the rope-like work around.
Yes, according to my mom, who was volunteering to nurse there, so they would go out on the estate, obviously, get fresh air and exercise and things, but pick the grasses, dry it, and were able to weave these baskets. Some artisan skill that they brought with them from Poland.
And obviously made during the wartime, it's a fine example of trench art. Trench art is something created by a soldier, sailor, or airman in their downtime. It can be a sculpture, it can be a carving, it can be something created from materials that are around. And in this case, the materials were the long grasses of the Scottish Highlands. About 2,500 Polish military people married Scottish women. And obviously, Monterey played a role in that. Maybe we can get some sense of how it was started and a bit about your family as well.
My grandfather was the Secretary of State for Scotland, and at the time that Monterey was converted, he was the Minister of Shipping. My grandmother had served in World War I in Salonique, VAD, they call it, Voluntary Aid Division, Red Cross trained. And I think they felt like they wanted to do something to contribute to the war effort. So they offered the house to the government and said, would this work as a hospital? And they went through the process. I have the paperwork that was going back and forth about that from the health department and whatnot. We have a letter from Winston Churchill, who my grandfather was in cabinet with, thanking them for offering Montreve as a hospital, and started as a hospital in 1942.
Montreve, I think, is a perfect example of what happened in the United Kingdom between 1939 and 45. A number of large facilities, country homes, stately parks, were all repurposed for the wartime effort. This particular home was repurposed to provide a support to injured and wounded soldiers in the middle of rural Scotland. Obviously, a major player in this story is your mother. Maybe you can give us a sense of her story.
She was born in 1922, so at the beginning of the war she was less than 20. So she grew up living at Montreve House till she was 10 or 11 with a governess, and went off to boarding school. And then she was in Paris at the beginning of the war. Received a telegram from my grandfather, which was a pre-agreed on code if something went wrong. She got the telegram saying Aunt Ma's seriously ill, returned home immediately, and went back to Scotland. One family story my mom used to tell would be loading all the paintings and taking it up to another building to store them. And it was up further on the hill so they could get a view out over the Firth of Forth from there. And she saw the first German air raid on shipping in the Firth of Forth.
When the soldiers and the airmen and sailors arrived in 1942, was she actually engaged with them? What was her role?
So my mom worked as what we would call a nursing assistant these days. They had, I think, 1,600 patients or something through there during the time that it operated as a hospital. It had about 52 beds, so it was, a fair-sized operation.
So she obviously was introduced to the soldiers, and there's a large contingent of Polish armed forces there as well?
Yes, yeah. She became fluent in Polish.
Right.
She spent 3 years probably working in this hospital with these soldiers. The Polish army and individuals certainly expressed heartfelt gratitude. I mean, they made things like this and gave it to the family, but also as an oil painting of my mother and a calligraphy piece that was wishes for their wedding, and several letters from, I think, 3 different Polish generals. My father went to the UK in 1938 and joined the RAF and was stationed at Lucas, which is just outside St. Andrews, which is quite close by. So his story about how they connected, my mother and my father, was his squadron leaders came to him one day and said, we're invited to Montreve to a shoot, which meant they'd be shooting pheasants or quail, people beating. You've seen those things in movies and books. And so off they go to Montreve to this shoot. And my mother was in the group of people that were beating, like walking through the field, getting the birds to fly toward the people with the guns. And she was on the other side of a hedge. My father fired at a bird and she was nearly missed. So she came storming through the hedge saying, what do you think you're doing here? Almost shot me. And according to her, the rest is history. But
the Polish contribution to the British Armed Forces was significant. and a large number of Polish airmen escaped through the various ports. 16 squadrons were created that were mainly Polish, operated and flown in. And the majority of those squadrons were active throughout from 1940 right through to the end of the war. Most of them were fighter squadrons, a number were bomber squadrons, and also Coastal Command anti-submarine work. 145 Polish airmen flew in the Battle of Britain. And interesting statistic is that Polish airmen were about 5%, but they had 12% of the kills. This is a fantastic artifact of a time that's now, 80 years ago. I think obviously it needs to be shared with a larger audience. So what is its future? What do you see becoming of this?
I've been talking to the Polish consulate here. I'm thinking I'm going to talk to the embassy in Ottawa. There's a Polish society actually as they're displaying meat, whatever, in a church in North End, Dartmouth. So before it goes somewhere else, maybe it should be just shown to them if they have a meeting or something.
The story that Jane told today was one of a family at war. It's part of Jane's personal history, but those personal histories become a bigger part of World War II.
Coming up on Militaria.
Basket-hilt started to come into vogue in Europe at around 1600s because it protected the hands more and more easy to handle rather than taking a big 1.5 or 2-handed sword. Well, my name is Ken Chislett. I'm retired. I spent 35 years in the RCMP and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. I brought in a 17th century Scottish basket-hilt sword. The original owner was Dr. Ross McGuinness. I ended up purchasing off Dr. McGuinness before he passed on.
The Scottish Highlands are a majestic and mystical place with a blood-stained history. In 1745, the Highland Scots got caught up in a war over the British throne known as the Jacobite Rising. The Rising ended the following year when the British Army routed the Scottish Highlanders at the Battle of Culloden. The British then took revenge against the Scots through a campaign known as the Highland Clearances. Led by Edward Cornwallis, who later became the controversial founder of Halifax, British soldiers murdered and raped Highlanders, burned their homes, and destroyed their crops. Thousands of Scots fled to the New World, including many who settled in Nova Scotia.
Ken, I was wondering for the folks at home if you could describe this sword that you've brought in.
This is an example of what they call an Irish hilt basket sword, Scottish. And what that means is that the style of the hilt is like a basket. Basket hilt started to come into vogue in Europe at around 1600s because it protected the hands more and more easy to handle rather than taking a big 1.5 or 2-handed sword. The blade is probably off an original older longsword. When they started to go to the basket, then they took the blades, shortened them, and re-hilted them. I obtained the sword from Dr. Ross McGuinness some years ago. He was quite a well-known collector and very knowledgeable in the field of firearms and weaponry. He obtained the sword in an auction in Birmingham, England in 1970 and speculated at the time that the sword may have been one of the swords brought south from the Battle of Culloden in 1746.
So this is an extraordinary piece of history. If this was at Culloden, this blade would have been likely, maybe a century old by that time.
Yeah.
Quite common in the 14th, 15th, and early 16th century. And again, this blade is probably, I think it is, I agree with you, this is a part of a larger, longer sword that has been reduced down to a more manageable size. And again, and this coincides with the rise of musketry in warfare in the British Isles and across Western Europe. So these swords are, again, this is an interesting period of transition from one type of sword into another. And again, the difference in this hilt as compared to what we'll see coming out of Scotland within, like, say, 25 or 30 years.
The regulation swords were much more uniform and much better finished. This was a Highlander sword that was probably made in a local village from a local blacksmith.
Exactly, yep. In the wake of the Battle of Culloden in 1746, the British Crown, to try to eliminate this ongoing threat from the Scottish Highlanders and the claim of the House of Stuart to the British Crown, they come up with proscription laws. So Highlanders were no longer allowed to carry arms, so a sword or a dirk, anything like that. You couldn't go out armed. and the Highlands used to be a fairly dangerous place.
Yes.
And with that, there are no kilts, you can't speak Gaelic, you weren't allowed to go to a university. What else? You could no bagpipes, and you weren't allowed to own a horse worth more than 5 pounds. So they have all these things to kind of like bracket in and shut down traditional Highland culture. So a big turning point in that is during the 7 Years' War. So when Great Britain makes the sort of strategic decision to campaign against France in North America, well, Frederick the Great bottles up the armies on the continent. The British develop what they'll call eventually the American Army. So the first American Army is the British Army here in North America during the 7 Years' Wars. So through those prescription laws, those heads of clan, for like the Frasers, the Mackenzies, all the old Jacobite families, they're made a bargain with the British Crown that if they'll raise Highland troops to go and serve in North America, all these elements of the prescription laws will be done away with. And so you can have bagpipes again. You'll be given a sword, a broadsword, a dirk, a pistol and a musket. Orders will be given in Gaelic. So with that, the regiments in the 7 Years' War and later in the American Revolution, Highland regiments become the holding place of much of traditional Highland culture. With that, again, you start to see a lot of these soldiers that are in the Montgomery 77th Highlanders, the Fraser 78th Highlanders. Many of them stay in North America and what becomes Canada. And an interesting footnote to all this, going back to the time of Bonnie Prince Charlie and Culloden, is when Great Britain and France go to the peace table after the War of the Spanish Succession in 1746, one of the sort of deals that are cut, and it's one of the biggest ones, is that if the French crown will no longer support the Stuart claim to the British throne, Britain is willing to give back Louisbourg to France. And that is an enormous sort of thing that it's kind of forgotten sometimes, but that's one of the things that finally gets France, Louisbourg back. And again, we'll start to stir the pot and plant the seeds for what will lead to the American Revolution because of this resentment and anger that New Englanders feel about the loss of all their young men in the winter of 1746 up in Louisbourg. This is the part of the program where sometimes we're asked to ask a contributor if they'd be interested in donating this at some point to the Army Museum. You know, this is like one of the great centerpieces of your collection, and it has the great memory too coming from a mutual old friend, Ross McGinnis. But with that, I can't say enough how much I appreciate you bringing this in and let me have a look at it. So it's remarkable to see it, and again, have that connection again with talking about Ross McGinnis. Well, thanks again so much for coming in.
Thank you.
It's good to see you again. Okay.
Kevin was able to confirm and reinforce the information I already had. And it was great to get the information, Kevin, on some of the background and history of the other regiments and the Highland situation at the time.
You don't see swords like that around this part of the world very often. It looked kind of familiar to me in an odd way. And I thought, well, I've probably seen it in a book on, basket-hilts or something. But then it turned out to be from Dr. Ross McGinnis's collection. To have that connection with that piece of history, and again, with the local history with Ross McGinnis, it was very nice, actually.